The winter night of February 12, 2004 arrived in Traverse City, Michigan, with the kind of cold that cuts through bone and the promise of a storm that would bury secrets beneath layers of pristine snow. By 7:32 p.m. the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees below zero, and snowflakes the size of silver dollars tumbled from a sky black as ink, each one catching the amber glow of a solitary streetlight on the desolate stretch of M72. It was here, on this forgotten ribbon of asphalt that cuts through Michigan's winter wilderness like a scar, that truck driver Billy Kowalski spotted something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A silver Honda Civic sat idling on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking like a distress signal against the storm. Steam rose from the exhaust pipe in ghostly plumes. The driver's door hung open, swaying gently in the bitter wind that howled through the pine trees. Kowalski pulled his 18-wheeler to a stop, his diesel engine rumbling like distant thunder. Through the swirling snow, he could see the car's interior light casting an eerie yellow glow. A purse sat undisturbed on the passenger seat. Keys dangled from the ignition. Most unsettling of all, a white paper coffee cup rested in the center console's cup holder, still steaming in the freezing air. But where was the driver? Kowalski called out into the darkness, his voice swallowed by the wind. He circled the vehicle, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep and falling faster by the minute. There were no footprints leading away from the car, no signs of struggle, no trace of the person who had been there just moments before. Inside the Honda, the radio played softly, a love song that seemed obscene in its cheerfulness. The heater was cranked to high, the windows slightly fogged. Everything suggested someone who had stepped away for just a moment, perhaps to check a tire or clear ice from a headlight. But the snow was already covering any evidence of where they might have gone. When Kowalski finally reached for his cell phone to call 911, his hands shook, not from the cold, but from a deep, primal understanding that he had stumbled upon something terrible. Something that would transform the peaceful community of Traverse City into a place where neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, where every shadow held the possibility of answers, and where the name Sarah Chen would become synonymous with the kind of mystery that burrows into your soul and never lets go. The next 20 years would prove him right. Sarah Chen possessed the rare gift of making everyone she met feel like the most important person in the world. At 23, she moved through the halls of Northwestern Michigan College with the confidence of someone who had found her calling, her nursing textbooks tucked under one arm, her ever-present smile lighting up the winter corridors like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. She was the daughter of Henry and Lynn Chen, who had arrived in Traverse City in 1978 with 2 suitcases, limited English, and an unwavering determination to build something beautiful for their future children. Chen's Kitchen, their modest restaurant on Front Street, had become more than just a place to eat. It was the beating heart of the community, where Sarah had grown up folding napkins at corner tables and charming customers with her precocious chatter about wanting to make sick people feel better. By 2004, that childhood dream had crystallized into something concrete. Sarah was 2 semesters away from graduating with her nursing degree, already accepted into the pediatric program at Munson Medical Center. Her professors spoke of her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural talents. She had an intuitive understanding of patient care that couldn't be taught, a gentleness that seemed to ease pain before medication ever could. Her relationship with Marcus Williams was the stuff of small-town legend. They had been inseparable since junior year of high school, when he was the star quarterback and she was the valedictorian who tutored him through calculus. Their engagement announcement in the Traverse City Record Eagle had prompted strangers to stop them on the street with congratulations. Their wedding was planned for June 19, 2004, a summer ceremony at the Old Mission Peninsula Chapel, followed by a reception in the Chen's restaurant. But in the weeks leading up to that February night, something had changed. Sarah's roommate, Jessica Martinez, would later tell investigators about late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, about Sarah staring out their apartment window with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of some terrible secret. When Jessica asked if everything was okay, Sarah would force that radiant smile and deflect with questions about Jessica's own life. She was still Sarah. Jessica would tell Detective Morrison months later, tears streaming down her face. But it was like someone had dimmed her light just a little. I should have pushed harder. I should have made her tell me what was wrong. None of them could have known that time was already running out, that winter night closing in like a trap, and that Sarah Chen, who had spent her entire life helping others, was about to need help that would never come. The security camera at Northwestern Michigan College's main entrance captured Sarah Chen's last confirmed sighting at 6:13 p.m. on February 12, 2004. The grainy black and white footage shows her pushing through the glass doors, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her breath visible in small puffs as she steps into the frigid evening air. She's wearing the navy blue winter coat her parents had given her for Christmas, the one with the fake fur collar she'd complained was too fancy but secretly loved. At 6:27 p.m., 14 minutes later, Sarah stopped at the Marathon gas station on Division Street. The receipt found later in her car shows she purchased a medium coffee, French vanilla, 2 sugars and a package of gum. The cashier, a 19-year-old named Derek Hoffman, remembered her because she'd been humming while she waited in line. "Some song I didn't recognize," he told police, but she seemed happy, normal, nothing weird about her at all. The next piece of the timeline comes from phone records. At 6:45 p.m., Sarah called her mother from her cell phone while driving. The conversation lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Lin Chen would replay those final words in her mind thousands of times. "I'm heading home now, Mom. Marcus is making dinner. I'll see you tomorrow for lunch." Her voice was clear, unstressed. There was no hint of the terror that was about to unfold. At 7 p.m. exactly, Marcus Williams sent Sarah a text message. "Dinner's ready when you are. Drive safe in this snow." The message was delivered but never read. Her phone's location services show it moving along M72 at highway speeds until 7:08 p.m. when it came to a complete stop at mile marker 47. The next 24 minutes are where the mystery deepens into nightmare. Sarah's car remained stationary at that location, engine running, heat on high. The snowfall was intensifying. Meteorological data from that evening shows visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile, with accumulation rates of 2 inches per hour. Wind gusts reached 35 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that would challenge even experienced winter drivers. But why did she stop? The car showed no signs of mechanical failure. The gas tank was 3/4 full. Her AAA card was in her wallet, her cell phone at 93% battery. If she'd been experiencing car trouble, why didn't she call for help? If she'd pulled over due to weather conditions, why did she leave the safety of her vehicle? At 7:32 p.m., Billy Kowalski spotted the abandoned Honda and called 911. When state troopers arrived 8 minutes later, they found Sarah's coffee still warm to the touch, not steaming hot, but warm enough to suggest she had been there moments before. The snow in and around the vehicle showed no footprints, but the accumulation rate meant any tracks would have been erased within minutes, 47 minutes, less than an hour between a daughter's loving phone call to her mother and her complete disappearance from the face of the earth. In those 47 minutes, something had transformed a routine drive home into the beginning of a mystery that would consume a community and destroy a family's faith in the fundamental order of the world. What happened in those 47 minutes would remain hidden for exactly 20 years. Dawn broke over Traverse City on February 13, 2004, revealing a world transformed by snow and a community about to be shattered by the realization that one of their own had simply vanished. By 8 a.m., the Chen's Kitchen parking lot had become an impromptu command center, filled with police vehicles, volunteer search coordinators, and neighbors clutching steaming cups of coffee while organizing into search teams. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at the scene, having worked through the night, his weathered face etched with the kind of grim determination that comes from 30 years of law enforcement. At 52, Morrison had seen his share of missing person cases, but something about the pristine condition of Sarah's abandoned car sent ice through his veins. Cars don't just lose their drivers. People don't simply evaporate into winter air. The first search teams deployed at sunrise, more than 300 volunteers from across Grand Traverse County, trudging through snow that had accumulated to nearly 2 feet overnight. They moved in systematic grids through the dense pine forests flanking M72, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse, their breath forming clouds that dissipated as quickly as their hopes. The K9 units arrived from Grand Rapids by noon, 2 German shepherds named Rex and Lady, who were renowned for their tracking abilities. But the dogs seemed confused by the scene, circling Sarah's car repeatedly before losing the scent at the road's edge, as if she had simply dissolved into the asphalt. Their handlers tried every technique in their arsenal, starting from different points, using items from Sarah's apartment to reinforce her scent, but the results were the same. Nothing. By the second day, dive teams were probing the icy waters of the Boardman River. Despite the fact that the waterway lay more than a quarter mile from where Sarah's car was found, divers in dry suits descended through holes cut in 18-inch thick ice, their underwater lights creating eerie patterns in the black water below. They found nothing but old tires and discarded fishing equipment. The media descended like vultures. News vans lined the streets around Chen's kitchen, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray skies like mechanical prayers. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to speak, transforming private grief into public spectacle. Sarah's high school yearbook photo appeared on television screens across Michigan, her bright smile becoming the face of a tragedy no one yet understood. On February 15, Detective Morrison held his first press conference. Standing before a wall of cameras, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him, he spoke words that would haunt the investigation for decades. Sarah Chen is a beloved member of this community. We are exploring every possible avenue to find her and bring her home safely. But I'll be honest with you, it's like she simply vanished into the winter air. The phrase stuck, vanished into the winter air, became the shorthand for a case that defied logic, that challenged everything the community thought it knew about cause and effect, about the natural order of disappearance and discovery. As the search entered its third day with no trace of Sarah Chen, a terrible understanding began to settle over Traverse City, like the snow that continued to fall. Their safe, predictable world had been revealed as an illusion. Someone among them knew what had happened. Someone was keeping secrets, and everyone was now a suspect. By the end of the first week, Traverse City had transformed into a community divided by suspicion and speculation. Chen's kitchen, once a gathering place for celebration and comfort, became an uncomfortable shrine where whispered theories competed with hushed prayer. Sarah's smiling photograph, enlarged and mounted beside the cash register, watched over conversations that grew more paranoid with each passing day. The first rumors centered on Sarah herself. Had she been keeping secret? Jessica Martinez, under pressure from investigators and her own guilt, reluctantly revealed that Sarah had seemed stressed in recent weeks, though she couldn't pinpoint the source. This admission spread through the community like spilled wine, staining everything it touched. Suddenly, neighbors who had known Sarah since childhood began questioning whether they'd ever really known her at all. The speculation grew darker. Someone claimed Sarah had gambling debts, a ludicrous notion to anyone who knew her frugal nature, but fear has a way of making the impossible seem plausible. Others whispered about secret relationships, citing the way she'd been protective of her phone in recent weeks. Each theory spawned 5 more, until the Sarah Chen who had disappeared bore little resemblance to the woman who had actually lived among them. Marcus Williams found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Why wasn't he with her that night? Why didn't he report her missing until his answers? He'd been preparing dinner, assumed she'd stopped somewhere to wait out the storm, sounded reasonable individually but somehow suspicious in aggregate. Neighbors who had watched him and Sarah grow up together now studied his face for signs of deception, analyzing his tears for authenticity. More disturbing was the emergence of David Crane, Sarah's ex-boyfriend from freshman year of college. Their relationship had been brief and seemingly amicable, but David's subsequent transfer to Eastern Michigan University began to look less like academic opportunity and more like suspicious flight. When investigators tracked him down in Ypsilanti, his alibis seemed solid but not ironclad. He'd been at work at a local restaurant until 11 p.m. on February 12, but co-workers couldn't account for every minute of his shift. Perhaps most shocking was the cloud of suspicion that fell over Professor Michael Patterson from Northwestern Michigan College. At 43, married with 2 children, Patterson taught anatomy and physiology classes. Sarah had taken the previous semester. Students began recalling how his attention toward Sarah had seemed different, how he'd linger after her questions, how he'd offered extra tutoring sessions that other students didn't receive. Patterson vehemently denied any inappropriate relationship, but in a town hungry for answers, his protests only fed the growing appetite for scandal. The community fractured along lines of loyalty and suspicion. Sarah's supporters rallied around the Chen family, organizing prayer vigils and fundraising dinners, but others whispered that where there's smoke, there's fire, that good girls from good families don't just disappear unless they're involved in something dark. At Chen's kitchen, Henry and Lynn watched their daughter's reputation dissected with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to her nursing studies. They saw friends avoid eye contact, heard conversations stop when they entered rooms. The town that had embraced their family 30 years earlier was now treating them like contaminated objects to be pitied, certainly, but also to be kept at a safe distance. The whispers in the snow were drowning out the truth, and Detective Morrison knew that with each passing day, the real answers were being buried deeper beneath layers of speculation and fear. Detective Ray Morrison's office became a shrine to obsession. By the 6th month of Sarah Chen's disappearance, every available wall space was covered with timeline charts, aerial photographs, and maps of Grand Traverse County marked with colored pins, indicating search areas, witness sightings, and dead ends. The centerpiece was an enlarged photograph of that desolate stretch of M72, where Sarah's car had been found, staring back at him like an accusation every morning when he arrived before dawn. Morrison's partner, Detective Linda Vasquez, watched with growing concern as her colleague slipped deeper into what she privately called the Sarah hole. He worked weekends when he should have been at his daughter's soccer game. He skipped lunch to re-interview witnesses who had nothing new to say. His wife, Carol, called the station with increasing frequency, her voice tight with the strain of competing with a ghost for her husband's attention. Ray's eating himself alive over this case, Vasquez confided to their sergeant. He thinks if he just stares at those photos long enough, they'll tell him something he missed. But Morrison couldn't let go. Every detective carries cases that burrow under their skin, but Sarah Chen had done more than that. She had taken up residence in his soul. His theory evolved over months of sleepless nights and endless speculation. Initially, he'd favored the wrong place, wrong time scenario. Sarah stopping to help someone, or being forced off the road by a stranger with criminal intent. The complete absence of evidence supported this theory. Experienced predators leave no traces, make no mistakes that ordinary criminals stumble into. But as months stretched into years, Morrison began to lean toward a more disturbing possibility, that Sarah's disappearance was personal, targeted, and orchestrated by someone who knew her routines, her route home, her vulnerability. Someone who understood that a winter storm would erase evidence, that a desolate stretch of highway would provide perfect cover, that a young woman's inherent trust in familiar faces would make her easy prey. His case notes from year 2 contain entries that read more like a personal journal than professional documentation. Woke up at 3 a.m. thinking about the coffee cup, still warm. What kind of person stops to buy coffee if they know they're about to disappear? What kind of monster waits for someone to take that last sip before striking? And later, I dream about that stretch of road. In the dream, I'm there when it happens, but I can never move fast enough to stop it. Morrison's obsession cost him. His marriage strained under the weight of unanswered phone calls and forgotten anniversaries. His daughter grew up associating her father with case files and crime scene photos, rather than bedtime stories and playground visits. Carol Morrison would later say that Sarah Chen claimed 2 victims, herself and the man her husband used to be. The department offered Morrison the chance to pass the case to another detective, multiple times. Each offer was met with the same response: "I'm not giving up on her." It became his motto, his mantra, his curse, because in Morrison's mind, giving up on Sarah Chen meant accepting that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, that some families were destined to live forever in the liminal space between hope and despair. He refused to accept that possibility, even as it consumed everything else he held dear. Hope, Detective Morrison learned, could be more cruel than despair. At least despair offered the terrible comfort of certainty, while hope dangled possibilities that crumbled like autumn leaves the moment you tried to grasp them. The first false lead came in year 3, when a convenience store clerk in Detroit claimed to have seen a woman matching Sarah's description, purchasing cigarettes and a road map. The woman was Asian, petite, with shoulder-length black hair, a description that fit thousands of women across Michigan. But desperate families and obsessed detectives tend to see what they need to see. Morrison drove the 4 hours to Detroit himself, studied the grainy security footage until his eyes burned, interviewed the clerk who swore he never forgot her face. The woman was Michelle Kim, a 26-year-old pharmacy student who had been visiting her grandmother. She had never heard of Sarah Chen, had never been to Traverse City, and possessed a driver's license that placed her in Detroit on February 12. Morrison returned home with another dead end, and the bitter taste of wasted hope. Year 5 brought an even more devastating false alarm. Thomas Wheeler, a convicted felon, serving time for armed robbery at the Lakeland Correctional Facility, contacted authorities,
claiming he had information about Sarah Chen's disappearance. Wheeler wove an elaborate tale about a friend who had picked up some Chinese girl on a rural highway and bragged about dumping her body in Higgins Lake. The confession sparked a massive search operation. Dive teams spent 3 weeks in the frigid waters of Higgins Lake, methodically searching every inch of the bottom with sonar equipment and underwater cameras. The Chen family maintained a vigil on the shore, Henry and Lynn clutching each other as divers surfaced again and again with nothing but mud and debris. Wheeler's story unraveled when investigators discovered he had been in solitary confinement on February 12, 2000. But by then the damage was done. The Chen family had endured weeks of renewed agony, believing they might finally have answers, only to be plunged back into the abyss of uncertainty. The psychics were perhaps the cruelest tormentors of all. They arrived in waves, claiming divine insight into Sarah's fate. Margaret Thornton, a self-proclaimed medium from Grand Rapids, insisted that Sarah was near water, surrounded by tall pines, a description that encompassed roughly half of northern Michigan. Her visions led to fruitless searches of Pine Lake, Spider Lake, and dozens of smaller bodies of water scattered throughout the region. Another psychic claimed Sarah was alive but suffering from amnesia, living under a different name in a facility for troubled women in Ohio. This led to a heartbreaking expedition, where Lin Chen traveled to Columbus to meet with administrators and walk the halls, studying the faces of patients who had forgotten their own names, hoping against hope to find her daughter among the lost. Each anniversary brought renewed media attention and renewed heartbreak. Local news stations would resurrect the story with updated graphics and the same haunting questions. Where is Sarah Chen? The coverage invariably generated new tips, new theories, new false hopes that would be methodically investigated and ultimately discarded. Marcus Williams left Traverse City after year 7, unable to bear the constant reminder of what he'd lost. The engagement ring he'd placed on Sarah's finger remained in evidence storage, a symbol of a future that had been murdered along with his fiancée. His departure sparked fresh speculation. Was he fleeing guilt or simply trying to heal? As the 10th anniversary approached, Morrison realized he was no longer investigating a missing person case. He was documenting the slow destruction of a family, the gradual erosion of a community's innocence, and his own transformation from optimistic detective to haunted guardian of the dead. But he never stopped believing that someday, somehow the truth would surface. He just never imagined it would take 20 years. 15 years after Sarah's disappearance, the Chen family home had become a museum of interrupted life. Her childhood bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it the morning of February 12, 2004, nursing textbooks stacked on the desk, her Northwestern Michigan College sweatshirt draped over the chair, the engagement photo, with Marcus smiling from her nightstand. Lin Chen dusted the room weekly, changed the sheets monthly, and kept fresh flowers on the windowsill as if expecting her daughter to return from a particularly long day at school. The ritual had become sacred to Lin, a mother's desperate attempt to hold time still in the one place where Sarah remained 19 years old, full of dreams and untouched by whatever horror had claimed her. Henry would find his wife standing in the doorway sometimes, staring at the unmade bed, her lips moving in silent conversation with the daughter, who existed now only in memory and anguish. Chen's kitchen had evolved into an unofficial memorial, though the family never intended it that way. Customers would approach the hostess, stand and ask quietly if this was Sarah's family's restaurant. A wall near the entrance displayed her nursing school photo, alongside news clippings from the search efforts, prayer cards from memorial services, and letters from strangers offering support. The display grew each year as people continued to remember, continued to care, continued to hope alongside a family that was slowly dying from the inside out. Holiday celebrations became exercises in elaborate pretense. Every Thanksgiving, Lynn set a place for Sarah, at the family table, complete china, polished silverware, a cloth napkin folded in the precise triangle Sarah had preferred since childhood. Christmas morning featured presents purchased with painful optimism, wrapped in paper that grew dusty on the mantelpiece, as months passed without a recipient to claim them. Henry's health began failing in year 12, the stress of unsolved grief manifesting in high blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and a persistent cough that doctors couldn't fully explain. His last coherent wish, whispered to Lynn during a particularly bad episode, was simply to know what had happened to their daughter before he died. Not to see justice done, not to have someone punished, just to know. The not knowing, he said, was eating him from the inside like cancer. Sarah's younger sister, Amy, returned from college in California, transformed by grief into someone her parents barely recognized. The bubbly teenager, who had left for Berkeley, had been replaced by a young woman, who chose her words carefully, who flinched when people mentioned her sister's name, who had learned to navigate conversations like a minefield, where any topic might explode into painful memory. Amy eventually took over daily operations of Chen's kitchen. When Henry's health declined too far for him to continue, she modernized the menu, updated the decor, and tried to return the restaurant to its former role as a gathering place for celebration rather than mourning. But Sarah's presence lingered in every corner, in the corner booth where she'd done homework, in the kitchen where she'd helped prepare meals during high school, in the way longtime customers still asked about her as if she might walk through the door at any moment. The cruelest torture was the way hope would resurge without warning. A phone call from someone claiming to have seen Sarah in another city, a letter from a prisoner claiming knowledge of her fate. Each resurgence would lift the family briefly toward the surface of their grief, before dragging them back down to even greater depth. On Sarah's would-be 38th birthday, Lin Chen sat alone in her daughter's frozen bedroom, holding the nursing degree Sarah would never receive, staring at engagement photos of a wedding that would never happen. She whispered to the silence, "I don't know how to let you go. I don't know how to give up, but I don't know how to keep living like this either." She couldn't have known that the answer was only months away. Detective Carla Reeves approached cold cases the way a surgeon approaches a complex operation, with methodical precision, unflinching attention to detail, and the understanding that one small oversight could mean the difference between resolution and eternal mystery. When she inherited the Sarah Chen file in January 2024, she brought 20 years of investigative experience and access to forensic technologies that had been science fiction when Sarah disappeared. Reeves spent her first month immersed in Morrison's obsessively detailed case files, studying every interview transcript, every photograph, every seemingly insignificant piece of evidence that had been collected and catalogued over 2 decades. Morrison, now retired but still haunted by the case, met with her weekly to share insights that had never made it into official reports, hunches, observations, the kind of intuitive knowledge that only comes from living inside a case for half a lifetime. "There's something here," Morrison told her during one of their coffee meetings at Chen's kitchen. "Something we missed. It's been driving me crazy for 20 years, but I know it's there." His weathered hands shook slightly as he pointed to the case timeline. She didn't just vanish. Someone made her vanish. Someone who knew what they were doing. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Advanced DNA phenotyping had revolutionized cold case investigations, allowing forensic scientists to extract genetic material from evidence that previous generations of investigators couldn't have imagined useful. But Reeves was more interested in old-fashioned detective work, specifically a gas station receipt that had been sitting in the evidence locker for 20 years. The receipt from Marathon Station showed Sarah's final purchase: medium coffee, 2 sugars, and a package of Trident gum. What hadn't been tested in 2004, due to technological limitations, was a partial thumbprint on the receipt's backside, faint, incomplete, but potentially viable with modern enhancement technique. The print belonged to someone other than Sarah, someone who had handled the receipt after her purchase, but before it was found in her car. In 2004, this evidence would have been useless without a suspect to compare it to. But in 2024, Reeves had access to expanded databases that included not just criminal records, but employment fingerprints, military service records, and background check databases that encompassed millions of law-abiding citizens. The match came back on a Tuesday morning in March. The thumbprint belonged to someone in the law enforcement database, a requirement for all peace officers in Michigan. When Reeves saw the name that appeared on her computer screen, she felt the same disorientation Morrison had described 20 years earlier, as if the fundamental laws of reality had suddenly been rewritten. Deputy Thomas Chen, age 48, Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Department, 22 years of exemplary service, Sarah's cousin. Reeves stared at the screen for several minutes, certain there had been some mistake. Thomas Chen had been part of the initial search teams. He had comforted his grieving aunt and uncle. He had attended every memorial service, every anniversary vigil. He had helped coordinate volunteer searches, and had personally logged hundreds of hours, looking for his missing cousin. But forensic science doesn't lie. The thumbprint on Sarah's gas station receipt belonged to Thomas Chen, placing him in contact with evidence from her final transaction. Evidence that he had never mentioned during 20 years of family gatherings, investigative interviews, and solemn promises to find the truth about what happened that night. For the first time in 2 decades, someone connected to Sarah Chen's disappearance had made a mistake, and Detective Carla Reeves intended to make him pay for it. Deputy Thomas Chen's personnel file read like a textbook example of law enforcement excellence. In 22 years, with the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Department, he had received commendations for bravery, community service awards, and the respect of colleagues who considered him the embodiment of integrity in uniform. He had investigated domestic violence cases with unusual sensitivity, mentored young officers with patience and wisdom, and never once been the subject of a citizen complaint or internal affairs investigation. He was also Sarah Chen's cousin, 5 years her senior, and someone she had looked up to since childhood as the family's success story, the first Chen to attend college, the first to enter law enforcement, the golden boy who made his immigrant parents proud by serving the community that had welcomed their family decades. At family gatherings, Thomas and Sarah would often be found deep in conversation about her nursing studies and his police work, bonding over their shared desire to help others, which made Detective Reeves' discovery all the more devastating. The timeline she constructed painted a horrifying picture of betrayal and deception. On February 12, 2004, Thomas Chen was supposed to be attending a law enforcement training seminar in Lansing, a fact that had provided him with what appeared to be an ironclad alibi. But Reeves' painstaking investigation revealed discrepancies in the training records, gaps in the timeline that had never been properly verified, because no one had thought to suspect a fellow officer. More disturbing were the financial records Reeves uncovered through meticulous examination of court documents and credit reports. In the months leading up to Sarah's disappearance, Thomas had accumulated significant gambling debts, nearly $40,000 owed to various creditors, and more ominously, to individuals whose names appeared in organized crime database. The pressure had been mounting steadily, with threats escalating from phone calls to personal visits to his home. Bank records showed that Thomas had approached several family members for loans in late 2003 and early 2004, claiming he needed money for home improvements and his children's education. Most had agreed to help, but Sarah, practical, careful Sarah, had asked too many questions. Her nursing school budget was tight, and she wanted to understand exactly what the money was for before committing to a loan that would delay her graduation. Phone records from the weeks before her disappearance showed multiple calls between Thomas and Sarah, conversations that grew longer and more frequent as February progressed. The final call, placed from Thomas's cell phone to Sarah's in February 10, lasted 18 minutes, long enough for a desperate man to make a final plea for help, and long enough for a responsible young woman to ask the kinds of questions that could destroy someone's carefully constructed life. The most chilling revelation came from Thomas's own colleagues. During Reeves's interviews with the original search teams, she discovered that Thomas had volunteered for specific areas, had suggested particular search patterns, and had been instrumental in directing resources toward locations that, in retrospect, seemed designed to waste time and manpower. He had been part of the investigation not to find Sarah, but to ensure she would never be found. For 20 years, Thomas Chen had attended family dinners where his aunt and uncle wept for their missing daughter. He had looked Len Chen in the eye as she begged him to use his police contacts to find new leads. He had stood beside Henry Chen's hospital bed as the old man whispered his dying wish to know what had happened to Sarah. And through it all, Thomas had played the role of grieving cousin, dedicated officer and family protector while carrying the secret that would have destroyed them all. Detective Reeves realized she wasn't just solving a murder case. She was about to shatter a family that had already endured 20 years of unimaginable pain. But justice, she knew, demanded nothing less than the complete truth, regardless of who it destroyed in the process. The interrogation room at the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Department had witnessed thousands of confrontations between law enforcement and suspected criminals, but nothing quite like the scene that unfolded on March. Deputy Thomas Chen sat across from Detective Carla Reeves, still wearing his uniform, his service weapon and badge now evidence in the case against him. 20 years of lies were about to crumble under the weight of forensic evidence and relentless questioning. Reeves placed the enhanced photograph of the thumbprint on the table between them. The match was undeniable. Thomas's print on Sarah's gas station receipt, clear as a signature on
Confession. For several minutes he stared at the image in silence, his hands trembling slightly as the magnitude of his exposure settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "I need you to help me understand how your fingerprint got on this receipt, Thomas," Reeves said, a voice steady but not unkind. "This receipt was in Sarah's car when we found it that night. You told investigators you hadn't seen her for weeks before she disappeared." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the sheriff's department conducting its daily business around them. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to happen. You have to believe me. I loved Sarah. She was like a little sister to me." The confession that followed was perhaps more devastating than the crime itself. Thomas painted a picture of mounting desperation as his gambling debt spiraled beyond control. He had borrowed from family members, maxed out credit cards, and eventually found himself in debt to people who made their living through intimidation and violence. When they threatened his wife and children, when they began driving by his house at night and making phone calls at all hours, Thomas had reached the point where he would do anything to protect his family. Sarah had been his last hope. As the most financially responsible member of their generation, she had savings from her part-time work and a small inheritance from her grandmother. Thomas had approached her multiple times, growing more desperate with each refusal. Sarah wasn't cruel in her denial. She simply asked questions he couldn't answer, without revealing the truth about his gambling, questions that made him realize she would never willingly enable his self-destruction. The night of February 12, 2004, Thomas had followed Sarah from the gas station, hoping for one final chance to convince her. He pulled her over on that desolate stretch of M72, claiming there was a problem with her car that he had noticed. Sarah, trusting her cousin implicitly, had stepped out of her vehicle to examine whatever imaginary issue he described. "I just wanted to talk to her," Thomas sobbed, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I was going to explain about the gambling, about the threats, about what would happen to my family if I couldn't pay. But she was so angry when she realized I had lied to her, so disappointed. She said she was going to tell Uncle Henry and Aunt Lynn everything. She said I needed help, that the family needed to know what was happening." The argument had escalated quickly. Sarah, normally gentle and accommodating, was furious at being deceived and manipulated. She began walking back toward her car, threatening to drive straight to her parents and expose Thomas's secrets. In a moment of panic and rage, Thomas grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away, lost her footing on the icy shoulder, and fell backward toward the steep embankment that dropped toward the Boardman River. She hit her head on a rock. Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. There was so much blood. I kept shaking her, trying to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond. I checked for a pulse, tried CPR, everything I'd learned in training, but it was too late. She was gone. The cover-up that followed demonstrated 20 years of law enforcement experience, put to the most evil possible use. Thomas knew exactly how crime scenes were processed, what evidence would be looked for, how investigations were conducted. He used that knowledge to ensure Sarah would never be found, moving her body to a drainage culvert less than half a mile from where she died, a location that search teams had walked past dozens of times without realizing they were literally standing over her remains. I've lived with this every day for 20 years, Thomas confessed, his voice breaking completely. Every family dinner, every birthday, every time I looked at Uncle Henry and Aunt Lynn, I wanted to tell them. I knew it would destroy everything, not just me, but my wife, my kids, everyone who believed in me. As Reeves listened to Thomas's confession, she realized that Sarah Chen had been killed not by a stranger or a predator, but by the very person who should have protected her family, a police officer, someone she trusted completely. The betrayal was so profound, so unthinkable, that it had hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. Justice had finally arrived for Sarah Chen, but it came with the bitter knowledge that her killer had been comforting her family while her body lay hidden beneath their feet all along. The recovery of Sarah Chen's remains on April 3 brought an end to 20 years of uncertainty, but opened new wounds that cut deeper than anyone had imagined possible. The drainage culvert where Thomas had hidden her body had preserved her remains with heartbreaking completeness. She was still wearing the navy blue coat her parents had given her for Christmas, still carried the nursing textbooks that represented dreams that would never be fulfilled. The funeral service at the old Mission Peninsula Chapel should have been the wedding venue where Sarah married Marcus Williams in June 20. Instead, it became the site where a community finally laid to rest both a daughter and their own innocence. More than 800 people attended, filling every pew and spilling onto the grounds outside, united in grief that had been 20 years in the making. Lin Chen stood at her daughter's casket with the kind of dignity that only comes from having endured the unendurable. Her voice was steady as she spoke of finally being able to say goodbye, of knowing that Sarah was no longer lost in the winter darkness that had claimed her. But her eyes held a different story, the hollow recognition that their family had been destroyed twice, first by Sarah's murder, and now by the revelation of who had committed it. The Chen family's response to Thomas's confession split along lines that would never heal. Some members demanded forgiveness, clinging to their faith and their understanding of the man they thought they knew. Others, led by Amy Chen, called for the severest possible punishment, their anger sharpened by 20 years of watching their parents suffer, while their daughter's killer offered comfort and false hope. Marcus Williams returned to Traverse City for the funeral, gray-haired and weathered by 2 decades of living with unresolved grief. He approached Sarah's casket with the engagement ring he had carried for 20 years, placing it gently among the flowers that covered her final resting place. His vindication came at a price too high to calculate. He had been right to love her, right to trust her, but those truths could never restore the life they had planned together. Detective Ray Morrison stood at the back of the chapel, finally witnessing the closure that had eluded him throughout his career. The case that had consumed his professional life and destroyed his marriage was finally resolved, but victory felt hollow when measured against the cost. Sarah Chen had been found, but Morrison's family had been lost to his obsession with finding her. Thomas Chen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife divorced him within months of his arrest, taking their children and moving across the country to escape the shadow of his crimes. His colleagues in law enforcement spoke of feeling betrayed not just professionally, but personally. He had corrupted their brotherhood, used their trust as cover for 20 years of deception. Chen's kitchen remained open under Amy's management, but the memorial wall was quietly removed. The family needed to heal, to remember Sarah as she had lived rather than as she had died. The restaurant slowly returned to its role as a gathering place for celebration rather than mourning, though long-time customers still sometimes glanced toward the corner booth where a young nursing student once sat, doing homework and dreaming of helping sick children feel better. The case of Sarah Chen became a cautionary tale studied in law enforcement academies, a reminder that evil often hides behind familiar faces and trusted badges. But for the people of Traverse City, it served as a more fundamental lesson about the fragility of the trust that holds communities together, and the terrible price paid when that trust is betrayed by those sworn to protect it. On quiet winter nights when snow falls heavy across northern Michigan, some residents still think about that desolate stretch of M72 where Sarah Chen's car was found running in the darkness. But now they know the truth that eluded them for 20 years. Sometimes the monster isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone who sits at your table for Sunday dinner, someone who knows exactly how much you can bear to lose, and someone who takes everything anyway. The snow continues to fall, but it no longer hides secrets. Sarah Chen is finally home.